Right now, somewhere underneath the flat, quiet farmland of the Texas Panhandle, the ground has just done something it almost never does. An unusual earthquake has struck Texas, and scientists are already scrambling to figure out exactly what caused it. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand something most people watching the news coverage tonight will not. This is not a simple story. It is not a story with one clean answer. It is a story about a half-billion-year-old scar buried deep in the crust of the earth, and about a region that everybody assumed was geologically boring until it very suddenly was not. Stick around, because I am going to walk you through exactly what happened, why the experts still cannot agree on the cause, and why this event might be far more significant than the size of the earthquake alone suggests. Let's get into it. Here's what nobody disputes. An earthquake rattled a wide stretch of the Texas Panhandle, strong enough to be felt far beyond the epicenter itself, strong enough to wake people up in the middle of the night, and strong enough to immediately catch the attention of seismologists across multiple states. Within minutes, felt reports began pouring into the United States Geological Survey. Within the hour, researchers who study this exact stretch of land were already poring over the data, trying to work out what, exactly, had just moved beneath their feet. Most people, when they hear the words Texas and earthquake together, jump straight to one explanation: fracking. It is an understandable instinct. Texas is one of the largest oil and gas producing regions on the planet, and there has been real, well-documented seismic activity linked to drilling operations in parts of the state. But here's the problem with reaching for that explanation immediately in this case. The math does not add up cleanly. Typical earthquakes triggered by human drilling activity tend to be small, often too small for a person to even notice without instruments. When induced earthquakes do grow larger, it is usually because drilling operations happen to intersect directly with an existing fault line that was already under stress. An earthquake of this size, hitting this hard, this fast, is unusual even by the standards of induced seismicity. So, before we go further, let's be honest about something. This is a story where the obvious explanation might not be the correct one, and that is exactly what makes it worth digging into properly. So, what do we actually know? The earthquake struck in the early morning hours, centered in a remote, sparsely populated stretch of ranch and farmland near the Oklahoma border. This is genuinely quiet country. Cattle, wheat fields, long empty highways, and not much else for miles in any direction. And yet the shaking did not stay local. It traveled. Reports came in from cities well over 100 miles away. People described being jolted awake by a low, rolling rumble, the kind of sound more often associated with a distant freight train or a long roll of thunder than with the ground itself moving. For a region that is no stranger to genuine severe weather, hail, tornadoes, violent thunderstorms, there was something distinctly unsettling about a rumble that came from underneath instead of from the sky. The shallow depth of the earthquake is part of why it traveled so far and felt so strong at the surface. Shallow earthquakes tend to shake harder and wider than deep ones of a similar size, because the energy has less distance to travel and less rock to pass through before it reaches you. And that is exactly what happened here. Within hours, seismologists across several states were suddenly paying very close attention to a corner of the country that, under ordinary circumstances, almost nobody in that profession thinks about very often. And here is something that surprises most people the first time they hear it. This region has actually been shaking quietly for well over a century. It is not new. It is not a fluke. Researchers have documented seismic activity across this same general stretch of land going back well over 100 years, long before modern drilling technology, long before anyone was pumping wastewater underground at industrial scale. Multiple earthquakes over the decades have crossed meaningful size thresholds, scattered across different decades, sometimes years or even generations apart, almost as if this patch of ground has its own slow, private rhythm that has nothing to do with the oil industry at all. So what, exactly, is sitting underneath all that quiet cattle country? This is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, in the deep geological sense of the word. Buried beneath this entire stretch of the Panhandle lies an ancient structure that geologists refer to as a failed rift. Picture it like this. Roughly 500 million years ago, long before dinosaurs existed, long before anything with a backbone had crawled onto dry land, the North American continent tried to tear itself apart right along this exact stretch of crust. For reasons scientists are still working to fully understand, that process stalled. It never finished. Instead of splitting into two separate landmasses with a brand new ocean in between, the crust essentially healed back over itself, leaving behind a long, deep scar, weaker than the surrounding rock, more prone to fracturing under stress. And it has been sitting there ever since, patiently, silently, waiting for the right combination of pressure to wake it back up. Is this ancient buried scar the reason the ground shook this week? Do not jump to. Conclusions just yet, because there are several competing explanations currently on the table, and scientists genuinely have not settled on just one of them. Explanation number one is the one we have already been building toward. The idea that this ancient failed rift simply reactivated on its own, with zero human involvement required. This is currently considered the leading natural explanation among researchers studying the region. Here is the basic logic behind it. Tectonic stress accumulates slowly across an entire continent over enormous stretches of time, the kind of timeline that makes a single human lifetime look like the blink of an eye. Eventually, that accumulated stress finds the weakest available point in the crust and releases there. In this part of Texas, the weakest point happens to be that same old failed rift system, sitting exactly where IT has always sat, doing exactly what ancient scars in the earth eventually do. Under this explanation, nothing modern needs to be involved at all. It is simply geology, operating on its own enormous timescale, finally reaching the moment it was always going to reach. Explanation number two is one that almost nobody currently talks about, even though it is genuinely interesting once you hear it. Decades-old oil fields, several historical earthquakes in the same general region, stretching back across multiple past decades, happened directly above petroleum fields that were being actively drilled at the time. Researchers who studied those older events have suggested they may have been triggered, at least partially, by that historical drilling activity. But there is an honest limitation baked into that theory. The equipment available decades ago simply was not capable of pinning down the precise depth and location of those older earthquakes with the kind of accuracy modern instruments provide today. Which means this remains a real, open scientific question, not a settled conclusion one way or the other. Explanation number three is the one most people reach for first. The moment they hear the word Texas paired with the word earthquake, modern wastewater injection tied to oil and gas operations, commonly lumped together in the public imagination under the general umbrella of fracking. And to be fair, this is a real, well-documented phenomenon in parts of the broader region, particularly in areas where researchers have built up years of careful data, connecting underground fluid injection to nearby fault activity. But here is where officials responding to this particular earthquake have been notably cautious. An earthquake of this size is genuinely large for one caused primarily by fluid injection. And unlike some of the extensively studied cases, location simply does not yet have that same depth of supporting evidence. Scientists are not ruling it out. They are also not rushing to confirm it. They are simply saying quite plainly that more data is needed before drawing any firm conclusion. Which brings us to explanation number four. And honestly, this might be my favorite one, because the truthful answer right now is simply that nobody fully knows yet. Within hours of the earthquake, scientists were already saying exactly that in public, determining the true cause of an event this takes real time. It requires careful data collection, detailed modeling, and patient cross-referencing of the earthquake's depth, its precise location, its timing relative to any nearby industrial activity, and the broader stress patterns already mapped across the region. In science, hearing the phrase, "we do not know yet," is not some kind of dodge or cop-out. In this specific case, it might genuinely be the single most accurate sentence in the entire story. Here's the detail that stopped me cold while digging into all of this. Geologists studying this exact ancient rift structure have pointed out that it shares a strikingly similar underlying architecture with another ancient failed rift buried in a completely different part of the country. That other rift happens to sit directly beneath the region, where several state borders meet in the central United States, the exact zone responsible for one of the most violent earthquake sequences in American history. A sequence so powerful that some historical accounts from that era describe a major river appearing to briefly reverse its own direction of flow. Church bells were reportedly rung by the shaking hundreds of miles away from the epicenter. To be completely clear here, no scientist studying this Texas earthquake is suggesting that the Panhandle is somehow due for a repeat of anything on that historic scale. Nobody's predicting a disaster of that magnitude happening here. What geologists are pointing out is actually narrower and honestly more interesting than any doomsday prediction. Both regions share the exact same fundamental geological ingredients: an old failed rift buried deep beneath the surface, silent for hundreds of millions of years at a stretch, following essentially the same basic underlying recipe. One of these ancient scars simply happens to sit beneath wheat fields and cattle ranches in Texas instead of beneath a major river valley in the middle of the country. So what happens next? Government seismologists ran their forecasting models within hours of the quake, estimating the odds of another earthquake of similar size or larger striking the same region in the coming days at a relatively small percentage. Small, but not zero. Damage modeling came back showing an overall low risk, largely because so few people actually live in this specific rural stretch of land, which means the odds of serious injury or major economic loss remain limited. But here is why the size of this particular earthquake matters so much from a statistical standpoint. This region has now experienced a small handful of earthquakes at this magnitude or higher across roughly the past century, which works out to something happening, historically speaking, somewhere in the range of once every few decades. Push the threshold up even slightly higher, and the odds shift dramatically. An earthquake, half a step larger than this one, might only occur in this specific region once every several decades to a full century. Push it higher still, and you are talking about something closer to a once-in-several-centuries event. In other words, this earthquake is not some bizarre statistical fluke that came out of nowhere. It looks a lot more like a clock finally striking the hour it was always eventually going to strike. Nobody knew exactly when that hour would arrive, because that is simply how earthquakes work. There is no way to know in advance with any real precision. Let's talk for a moment about the human side of this, because that part tends to get lost once a story shifts into geology. In the minutes after the shaking, local emergency dispatchers reported a wave of calls from residents who had no idea what had just happened to them. Some assumed it was an explosion at a nearby facility. Others assumed a truck had struck their house. A few, half asleep, genuinely thought a tornado had touched down, since this is a part of the country where funnel clouds are a far more familiar threat than tremors from below. It took a little while for word to spread that this had, in fact, been an earthquake, and a strong one at that. Ranchers, out checking on livestock in the earliest hours after sunrise, described picture frames knocked askew, dishes rattled loose in cabinets, and in a handful of cases, minor cracks appearing in older plaster walls. Nothing on the scale of structural collapse, and thankfully nobody was seriously hurt. But for a region that rarely, if ever, thinks about earthquakes as a genuine risk, it was enough to leave people rattled in more ways than one. It is also worth pointing out just how unevenly earthquake awareness is distributed across the country. In places like California, seismic activity is baked into daily life. Building codes account for it. School drills prepare children for it. An entire culture of earthquake preparedness has built up over generations. In the Texas Panhandle, none of that. Infrastructure of awareness really exists, because until fairly recently, almost nobody needed it. That mismatch, a genuinely significant earthquake striking a place with almost no cultural memory of what to do when the ground moves, is part of why this story generated so much attention so quickly. It was not just the size of the earthquake. It was the sheer unfamiliarity of the experience for almost everyone who lived through it. Local officials, for their part, moved carefully and deliberately in the hours that followed. Structural inspectors fanned out to check older buildings in the small towns closest to the epicenter. Utility companies checked pipelines and gas lines as a precaution. Standard practice after any earthquake of this size, even when no obvious damage has been reported. By the following afternoon, officials were able to confirm that no significant structural damage had occurred anywhere in the affected area, a genuinely fortunate outcome given how sparsely built up that stretch of land actually is. Had an earthquake of the same size struck beneath a dense urban center instead of quiet ranch land, the outcome could have looked very different indeed. It is worth pausing here to explain how scientists actually go about determining whether an earthquake was triggered by human activity in the first place, since that question keeps surfacing throughout coverage of stories like this one. Researchers typically examine several factors together, rather than relying on any single piece of evidence. They study the precise depth of the earthquake, since injection-triggered events tend to cluster at depths that closely match. The depth of nearby wastewater disposal wells. They study the exact location relative to any active injection sites in the area. They study the timing, checking whether seismic activity in the region increased noticeably following nearby industrial operations ramping up. And they compare the specific fault that ruptured against the broader regional stress patterns that geologists have already mapped out over the years. When enough of these factors line up cleanly together, scientists can build a genuinely confident case connecting an earthquake to industrial activity. When they do not line up cleanly, as appears to be the situation here so far, the honest and responsible scientific position is to withhold judgment and continue gathering additional data, rather than rushing toward a conclusion that the evidence does not yet fully support. There's also a peer-reviewed body of research examining earthquake activity across this exact region over several past decades, tracking smaller earthquakes accumulated gradually over a long multi-decade window. That research found a genuine, sustained rise in smaller seismic events over time, and concluded that a meaningful share of those specific smaller earthquakes showed signs consistent with a connection to underground wastewater injection tied to the oil industry. That is useful context, and it is worth taking seriously. But it is also worth being careful about exactly what it does and does not tell us. That earlier research was focused on a large number of small, routine earthquakes accumulated gradually across decades. It was not specifically studying an isolated, unusually large event like the one that just occurred, which is exactly why officials responding to this particular earthquake have been so hesitant to simply extend that same explanation onto this specific event without further investigation first. Let's go a little deeper into that historical comparison too, because I think it deserves more context than a passing mention. The earthquake sequence I referenced earlier, from the early 19th century, remains to this day widely considered among the most powerful earthquake sequences ever recorded in the history of the continental United States. Multiple massive earthquakes struck that region over the span of just a few months, strong enough to be felt as far away as the eastern seaboard, strong enough to ring church bells in cities hundreds of miles from the epicenter, and strong enough to permanently reshape parts of the local landscape. Because that region had almost no population at the time compared to today, the human toll was relatively limited given the sheer physical scale of the event. If a sequence of that same magnitude struck that same region today, given how much has been built up across that part of the country since the early 1800s, the consequences would look dramatically different and far more severe.